EO-441, a Ukrainian Shark reconnaissance drone orbiting at 3,800 meters above the Oskil River Valley, picks up movement on the northern bank near Dvorichna. Not a vehicle column, not an artillery position. Something more deliberate. Engineers, heavy equipment, and the unmistakable outline of pontoon sections being floated into the current. The coordinates are time-stamped, encrypted, and moving through a Starlink uplink before the first section reaches the water. 90 seconds later, the 92nd Assault Brigade's fire control loop has a targeting solution. Two M142 HIMARS launchers, positioned 62 kilometers to the west, are already warming their systems. On the riverbank, the Russian engineers of the 11th Pontoon-Bridge Regiment were doing exactly what they had trained for. Modular sections, timed assembly, EW cover overhead, and a Shahed wave keeping Ukrainian attention focused on Kharkiv to the south. On paper, the operation had every advantage: fog, darkness, electronic suppression, and a tree line that broke the thermal signature of their vehicles. From above, the picture looked entirely different. Every pontoon section floating into position was a data point. Every KamAZ 65225 tractor on the approach road was a coordinate. And once the Shark had a track on the site, the clock stopped working in Russia's favor. Here is the number that explains the entire story. 40 minutes. That is the minimum uninterrupted assembly time. A PP-2005M modular bridge needs to span a river the width of the Oskil near Dvorichna. 40 minutes of engineers working in the open, vehicles staging on a fixed approach road, and equipment visible to anything orbiting above. Ukraine's layered ISR network over the Oskil now closes that window in under 10. The gap between what Russian combat engineers need and what the battlefield will give them is not measured in doctrine or training. It is measured in the flight time of a GMLRS rocket, approximately 150 seconds from launcher to impact at 62 kilometers. Russia's 6th Combined Arms Army has known this problem for over 2 years. It has tried timing adjustments, heavier EW coverage, rotating fresh sapper battalions from reserve formations into the Kupiansk axis. None of it changes the underlying arithmetic. And on the morning of June 3, 2026, that arithmetic played out with the kind of precision that Russian mill bloggers from the Two Majors channel would later describe, with rare frankness, as a crossing that had been compromised from the first minute. This video is not about one bridge. It is about why Russia keeps committing the same $4 to $6 million asset against a $168,000 GMLRS rocket and losing the trade every time. It is about the kill chain that made this strike possible, the doctrine collapse behind it, and what it tells us about the state of Russian combat engineering in the third year of the full-scale invasion. To understand why June 3rd happened the way it did, you have to understand what Russia was trying to accomplish on the Oskil. The river runs roughly north-south through the Kupiansk operational area and has functioned as a natural barrier limiting Russian ground maneuver since Ukrainian forces recaptured the western bank in the Kharkiv offensive of autumn 2022. The 6th Combined Arms Army has been pressing on the Kupiansk axis persistently through 2025 and into 2026, trying to restore pressure on Ukrainian defensive lines and threaten the logistics corridor running through the city. But the Oskil keeps complicating that pressure. Every armored push that needs to cross in force requires bridging, and every bridging attempt requires surviving Ukrainian sensors. Russia's solution in the spring of 2026 was to lean harder on the assets it had left. The 11th Pontoon-Bridge Regiment, a formation built on Soviet-era engineering doctrine, had been reinforced with replacement personnel and additional PP-2005M equipment sourced partly from Belarusian military stocks, according to open-source defense researchers tracking Russian logistics in the theater. The regiment was rotated forward to support crossing operations on the Oskil and Siversky Donets system, and by late May, it had staged equipment in tree-line positions north of Dvorichna. The cover plan for the June 3rd attempt was layered. Russian EW assets in the area were reportedly active through the night of June 2nd and into the early morning, targeting Ukrainian drone communication links. Simultaneously, a Shahed 136 wave was launched against the Kharkiv region, a tactic Russia has used repeatedly to saturate Ukrainian air defense radar systems and pull reconnaissance assets toward urban defense. The logic of the operation was sound on paper. Create enough sensor noise that a river crossing team could float sections and begin assembly before Ukraine's kill chain could orient and respond. What the Russian planning staff does not appear to have adequately accounted for was the 92nd Assault Brigade's Shark drone operating autonomously at 3,800 meters with a direct Starlink uplink, covering the northern Oskil approaches as part of a standing ISR rotation the brigade had maintained continuously through the late spring campaign. The Shark is a Ukrainian-developed reconnaissance UAV with an operational ceiling that lets it orbit above most Russian short-range EW jamming envelopes. At 3,800 meters, its electro-optical payload can resolve ground-level activity with enough fidelity to distinguish pontoon sections from natural debris on the water surface and identify vehicle types on approach roads. The Starlink uplink means the data it collects does not have to route through a ground relay that could be jammed or degraded. It goes direct from the drone to the brigade's fire control system. At 0441 on June 3rd, the Shark's crew detected the first PP-2005M pontoon section being floated into the Oskil at a position approximately 1.4 kilometers north of the Dvorichna ferry crossing site. The thermal signature of the KamAZ 65225 tractors on the approach road confirmed this was a bridging operation, not a probe or a decoy. The coordinates were logged, the imagery was streamed to the 92nd Brigade's Fires Coordination Cell, and the targeting request went into the brigade's artillery and rocket fire control loop. 90 seconds. That is the elapsed time between first detection and coordinate delivery to the 27th Rocket Artillery Brigade's fire control system. Ukrainian open-source defense community accounts, citing General Staff reporting, noted the timing in subsequent analysis. 90 seconds from sensor to shooter queue. Put yourself in the position of the Russian engineering officer running this operation. His EW assets are active. The Shahed wave is drawing attention. The fog over the river is giving him visual concealment from ground-level observation. He has every reason to believe the window is open. And somewhere 62 kilometers to the west, 2 HIMARS launchers have just received his coordinates and are calculating a firing solution he cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot yet know is coming. The most dangerous moment for a Russian combat engineer on the Oskil is not when he hears the drone overhead. It is the moment he believes the EW coverage is working. The 27th Rocket Artillery Brigade is one of Ukraine's HIMARS-equipped formations operating in the Kharkiv-Kupiansk theater through the current phase of the campaign. Its launchers are pre-positioned for rapid response to time-sensitive targeting, which means they do not need to relocate to fire at a target 62 kilometers away. They need updated coordinates, a priority designation, and a clear firing window. All 3 were in the system by 0443. The first salvo left the launchers at 0444. GMLRS unitary rockets, the standard M31 variant with a 90-kilogram unitary warhead, travel at roughly Mach 3 and follow a ballistic arc that keeps them above Russian short-range intercept systems for most of their flight. At 62 kilometers, time of flight is approximately 150 seconds. The Russian engineers on the Oskil bank had no warning system capable of providing actionable alert within that window. The first salvo was not aimed at the bridge sections. It was aimed at the approach road. This is the targeting logic that makes Ukrainian HIMARS employment so tactically effective and so difficult for Russian engineers to survive. The approach road is fixed. The bridge assembly site can shift slightly along the bank, but the vehicles, the tractors, the PMM-2M ferry assets, and the crane equipment all have to approach from the road network feeding the crossing site. Crater the approach road at 2 or 3 points, and you do not just damage vehicles, you fix everything else in place. The bridge sections already in the water cannot be recovered quickly. The vehicles on the road cannot maneuver around fresh craters in darkness, in fog, under time pressure. The entire operation freezes. That is exactly what happened at 0447 when the first GMLRS impacts walked across the approach road north of Dvorichna. Ukrainian General Staff reporting, later corroborated by geolocated footage reviewed by OSINT analysts in the Ukrainian defense monitoring community, indicated at least 4 impact craters on the road surface, disabling at least 2 KamAZ 65225 tractors and blocking the primary vehicle lane. The Russian engineering team was now in an impossible position. The pontoon sections in the water were drifting. The vehicles that should have been hauling additional sections forward were disabled or blocked. The fog that had been covered was now concealing the craters from drivers trying to assess whether there was a path forward. And the 2 or 3 impacts distributed along the string are sufficient to break it into non-functional segments. The imagery reviewed by OSINT analysts in the days following the strike showed the pontoon string separated into 3 drifting sections, with visible deformation at the breakpoints consistent with direct or near-direct GMLRS impacts. The bridge was not just damaged. It was structurally non-recoverable without full section replacement. While the second salvo was still in flight, the 92nd Brigade's drone company was already launching its FPV follow-up package. This is the layered effects doctrine Ukrainian brigades have refined through 2 years of intensive combat. The HIMARS strike is not the end of the engagement sequence. It is the opener. The strike fixes and suppresses. The FPV swarm finishes specific targets that survive the blast radius and confirms damage on high-value equipment. In this case, the FPV priority list included the 2 KamAZ 65225 tractors disabled on the approach road but still intact enough to potentially be recovered, and the PMM-2M ferry asset the Russian engineers had staged downstream as an alternative crossing option. A PMM-2M ferry is a $1.2 to $1.8 million piece of specialist equipment. It is not easily replaced from Russian theater logistics, given the attrition the bridging branch has absorbed since 2022. The 92nd's drone company logged 2 KamAZ tractors and the PMM-2M as confirmed destroyed in their after-action reporting, with FPV footage later shared to Ukrainian defense community social media channels and reviewed by multiple OSINT analysts. By 05:14, the entire engagement was over. The time from first detection to confirmed end of the bridging operation, 33 minutes. The Russian engineers had not come close to the 40-minute minimum assembly threshold. The crossing attempt had been detected, targeted, struck, and confirmed destroyed before a single vehicle had made it across the river. The post-strike imagery that circulated through the OSINT community in the following 48 hours told the story more concisely than any analytical report could. 14 GMLRS impact craters confirmed in and around the crossing site. The pontoon string broken into 3 drifting sections, scattered across a 200-meter stretch of the Oskil. 2 KamAZ tractors and the PMM-2M confirmed destroyed by FPV. The approach road cratered at 4 points. And the 2 majors Russian Milblog channel, one of the more reliable indicators of Russian military sentiment in the information space, openly acknowledging the crossing had been compromised from the first minute, a remarkable admission from a source that typically manages its framing carefully. What this strike confirms about Russian combat engineering losses goes beyond a single bad morning on the Oskil. The 11th Pontoon-Bridge Regiment has been one of Russia's most attrited specialist formations across the full-scale invasion, and the June 3rd strike fits a pattern that British Ministry of Defense operational updates and independent defense analysts have tracked consistently since mid-2022. Going through the available OSINT documentation on Russian bridging losses in the Kupiansk theater, one detail kept surfacing. Russia is not losing bridging equipment to Ukrainian artillery because Ukrainian artillery has become more accurate. It is losing bridging equipment because Ukrainian ISR has become fast enough to compress the target engagement sequence below the threshold any bridging operation can survive. The accuracy of HIMARS was always sufficient. What changed was the speed of the sensor-to-shooter link. The mathematics of this asymmetry are not sustainable for Russia. A PP-2005M modular bridge set costs between 4 and 6 million. A PMM-2M ferry adds another 1.2 to 1.8 million. 2 KamAZ 65225 tractors at specialist military specification add roughly $400,000 to $600,000. The total Russian material loss at Dvorichna on June 3rd sits somewhere between 6 million and 8 million in specialist bridging and engineering assets. Assets that cannot be quickly replaced from Russian domestic production given the sanctions pressure on specialized military manufacturing and the attrition the engineering branch has absorbed over 30 months of intensive combat. Against that, Ukraine expended 14 GMLRS rockets at a production cost of approximately $168,000 each, plus FPV drones at an average unit cost of $500 to $800. Total Ukrainian expenditure to defeat the crossing attempt: approximately $2.5 million, including the full FPV package. The exchange ratio is roughly 3-to-1 in Ukraine's favor on direct material costs alone, and that calculation does not count the operational effect. Here is the take that will probably draw some disagreement in the comments, but it needs to be stated plainly. The Russian military's continued investment in river crossing capability for the Kupiansk axis is not a tactical mistake from poor local commanders. It is a doctrinal failure at the institutional level. The 6th Combined Arms Army's staff knows the sensor-to-shooter timeline Ukraine is achieving over the Oskil. They have watched this pattern repeat across dozens of bridging attempts since 2022. The decision to commit the 11th Regiment's assets on June 3rd was not made in ignorance of the risk. It was made because the operational imperative, maintaining pressure on the Kupiansk axis, was assessed as worth the attrition cost. That is not bad tactics. It is a broken operational calculus the Russian High Command has not found an answer to and continues to execute anyway. Subscribe to Fury Military so you don't miss the continuing analysis of how Russia is attempting to adapt its engineering doctrine to a sensor-saturated battlefield, and why those adaptations keep arriving too late and too thin to change the underlying math. What strikes us most about the Dvorichna engagement is what it reveals about the pace of adaptation on each side. Ukrainian brigades are now running sensor-to-shooter sequences that would have been considered exceptional performance for a NATO Corps-level fire support system in 2015. They are doing it at brigade level, routinely, with commercially derived UAV technology and a satellite internet uplink. The 92nd Assault Brigade did not need a dedicated ISR aircraft, a core fire control center, or a 48-hour targeting cycle. It needed a Shark drone, a Starlink terminal, and 90 seconds. Russia's response to this reality has been to accept the attrition and continue the operational tempo. That is a coherent strategy if you have enough replacement assets and enough time. The question, and the OSINT data does not give us a clean answer here, is whether the Russian military's specialist engineering branch has either. The replacement personnel rotated to the 11th Regiment through 2025 and 2026 have absorbed significant casualties. The pontoon sections imported from Belarusian stocks are finite, and the operational requirement to cross the Oskil has not diminished. The pattern that emerges from the cumulative record of Russian bridging attempts on the Kupiansk-Oskil axis through 2025 and into 2026 is one of diminishing capability meeting a fixed and unresolved requirement. Russia needs to cross in force. It cannot cross in force without bridging. Its bridging assets are being attritioned faster than they can be replaced. And the Ukrainian ISR network driving that attrition is not degrading. It is improving. What would you do if you were the Russian engineering officer assigned to plan the next crossing attempt on the Oskil? Work under heavier EW cover and hope the window opens? Try a night crossing during a communication blackout? Accept a smaller crossing force that can assemble faster? Comment your answer below, because the options are exactly as constrained as they look, and there is no obvious solution that does not carry its own fatal risk against Ukraine's current sensor density. The Dvorichna strike is one engagement in a campaign that has now run for over 2 years at full intensity, but it illustrates something about modern warfare that is not specific to Ukraine or to Russia. A river crossing is one of the most demanding operations in the conventional playbook. It requires time, concentration, and relative freedom from observation. The sensor-to-shooter timeline Ukraine has achieved over the Oskil eliminates all three simultaneously. The attacking force cannot have enough time because detection is now nearly instantaneous. It cannot concentrate because concentration makes it a better target. And it cannot achieve freedom from observation because the ISR network does not sleep. This is what sensor-driven warfare looks like, and why mass alone no longer wins. The 6th Combined Arms Army has significant mass on the Kupiansk axis. It has replaced personnel, rotated units, and maintained operational pressure through attrition that would have forced a pause in any previous large-scale conflict. but mass that cannot cross a river cannot exploit its advantages. And on the Oskil in June 2026, the mass stayed on the wrong bank. The broader question this engagement raises is one that military planners in every major army are now actively wrestling with. Can traditional mechanized formations, built around armor, artillery, and engineering support, survive a battlefield where being seen means being struck within minutes? The purpose of this analysis is not to glorify war, but to understand the military and human realities behind it. Because the clearer we see modern conflict, the clearer the value of deterrence, stability, and peace becomes.